Hello, learners, and welcome to the NPTEL course on Victorian literature. As promised, we will continue and conclude our discussion of Christina Rossetti's poem Goblin Market in this lecture. I have already summarized some aspects of the poem and also read from the poem some key sentences. I will continue doing that and also provide some interpretive comments on the allegorical treatment of ideas of consumption in the poem and how the poem ultimately describes and celebrates the values of sisterhood. I mentioned in the previous lecture that Laura had consumed the fruits on one occasion and was very much looking forward to another day of similar pleasures. On the second day, however, when the two sisters go out and look for or go out and place themselves in these situations where the goblins might arrive, only one of them, it seems, can hear the goblin merchant's call. And we are told that Laura kept straining her ears so that she may listen to this call, but she fails to listen to that call. Rossetti writes, listening ever, but not catching the customary cry, come by, with its iterated jingle of sugar-baited words, not for all her watching, once discerning, even one goblin racing, whisking, tumbling, hobbling, let alone the herds that used to tramp along the glen, in groups or single, of brisk fruit merchant men. Right? So when Laura finds that despite being extra alert, despite being more than usually sensitive to these calls, she's not able to hear anything. Further, when she finds that her sister Lizzie, despite not being sensitive, is able to hear that cry, that turns cold as stone. And it sends this message to Laura. She feels that something has happened and she is to be deprived of these pleasures. And this is how the poet describes the reaction. Laura turned cold as stone to find her sister heard that cry alone, that goblin cry, come buy our fruits, come buy. Must she then buy no more such dainty fruit? Must she no more that succulous pasture find, gone deaf and blind? Her tree of life drooped from the root. She no more swept the house, tended the fowls or cows, fetched honey, kneaded cakes of wheat, brought water from the brook, but sat down listless in the chimney nook and would not eat. So we see two things. First, there's some kind of supernatural or at least not scientifically understandable thing that's happened, which is the same goblins who used to sell fruits to both of them, or at least who used to call to both of the sisters, now seem to call only to one of them. But one of them, who responded to the call one day, is unable to listen to the same cry the next day. There is no scientific or logical explanation for this. And this connects to a lot of poetry, long, epic, spiritually exploratory poetry of this time, which use the language of science to explore and interrogate questions of faith. We have seen that briefly in Tennyson's In Memoriam, and we see a very different kind of relationship between faith and doubt in this poem. Science may not be able to explain why the same person cannot hear the same call on two different days, but science is not even needed. The kind of universe that Christina Rossetti creates for Goblin Market seems to exist almost without any awareness, almost in condescension to the presence of science, logic, and objective critical thinking. There is a reason, however. The reason is that this poem is invoking the biblical story, but it is also using the biblical story to tell another kind of story. It is not simply repeating the biblical story of denouncing sexuality or upholding morality, because that is certainly happening here, but that is only a very small part of what is happening here. The fact that Laura partook of sensuous, bodily, fleshly pleasures while consuming these forbidden fruits, and the fact that immediately after consuming these fruits, it is almost like an addiction has been incepted in her body, and she is being punished by being addicted to something that is no longer available. This part of the story replicates much of the biblical denunciation of sexuality and sexual desire. However, there is something else going on as well, and that is indicated in the stanza immediately after Laura's astonishment and petrification at learning that the goblins are there, but they're just not audible to her. That someone else can partake of the fruits the goblins sell, but those fruits are no longer available to her. What we are told is that as a consequence of learning this, as a consequence of knowing that Laura can no longer eat those fruits, but she will have to live with the memory of the pleasure that those fruits once gave her. And this combination of remembering the pleasure that was once given, but no longer able to partake of that pleasure in the present, produces a horrible, painful situation in which Laura does not do work. She sits down listless by the chimney rook and does not eat. But what the poem is more concerned with is the fact that the domestic bliss that the two sisters had, which involved sharing in a wide range of domestic labor, and also the kind of safety, security, and comfort that they derived from sleeping together. Both of these acts, the labor as well as the safety, which was available to these two sisters at home, both of these things are disrupted. Laura no longer sweeps the house, tends the fowl or cows, fetches honey, kneads cakes of wheat, etc. She doesn't do the work that a lot of women were doing, and she also doesn't eat, right? So the domestic economy is disrupted, right? And this is a problem. This is a problem which Lizzie is forced to address in her own way. We are told that Lizzie could not bear to watch this state into which her sister was degenerating. Right? Lizzie, who has all along had a very different approach to the goblin merchants and their calls. She has been hearing the calls, but unlike Laura, she has been physically blocking herself, physically blocking all her senses which might connect them to the goblins. She turns her eyes away, she blocks her ears with her fingers, so she does things in order to physically remove herself from the goblin merchants' calls. Because of this, she has avoided that situation in which she could eat the fruits. So Lizzie is the one who has not eaten the fruits. Therefore, she is constantly assaulted by these attractions, but she doesn't act on them. She listens to these calls, but does not respond. But that resolve is challenged. She sees the state in which her sister is and tries to do something to fix that situation. She wants to cure her sister. And ultimately, she thinks she can cure her sister by getting some more of those fruits for her, right? This is different from what Laura did. Laura ate the fruit herself and suffered. Lizzie doesn't want to eat the fruit herself. She only wants to buy some of it for her sister. And this is another way in which the poem returns to the theme of sisterhood, which is much more important for the poem's theological and spiritual frame than sensuality or sexual desire. Let us read exactly how Lizzie succeeds in her resolve to care for her sister. Lizzie longs, and this is Rossetti again, speaking about Lizzie, Rossetti writes, she longed to buy fruit to comfort her, but feared to pay too dear. She thought of Janie in her grave, who should have been a bride, but who for joys brides hope to have, fell sick and died. Jeannie is a reference to a character in a poem by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, the elder brother of Christina, who was a sort of mentor, but who also exerted a great deal of sometimes undue and overbearing influence on the young Christina. And these words, the reference to Jeannie and the manner in which Lizzie remembers Jeannie and seeks to avoid Jeannie's fate, gives us a very clear hint about the place of sexuality in the kind of moral universe that Rossetti is creating. There are multiple ways to gloss that connection, and the key sentence, the key words in Rossetti's poems are: Lizzie thinks of Jeannie in her grave. That is, Jeannie is a person, a girl who has died. Lizzie doesn't want to become Jeannie, doesn't want to die. Lizzie also doesn't want Laura to become like Jeannie. Lizzie fears that Laura is going in Jeannie's direction. She's not eating. She is sad and lonely the whole time. She's not working. She has lost the will to live, and she wants to rescue Laura from Jeannie's fate. What was Jeannie's fate? In the words that Rossetti gives to Lizzie, Jeannie should have been a bride, but who for joys brides hope to have, fell sick and died. The word bride rhymes with died, and again gives more fuel to that narrative, to that allegorical explanation of this poem, in which all association with sexuality, sexual desire, or sensuality is to be equated with mortality, death, sin, etc. So these words certainly support that allegorical reading. However, there are multiple ways in which we can read these words. The first is to gloss it thus: but who, instead of having joys brides hope to have, fell sick and died. Right? That is to say, Lizzie would like to have the joys that brides hope to have, but wants to avoid death. That is one. The second way to gloss it is, but who fell sick with desire for joys brides hope to have, then died. Right? And this is a sense that equates the state of being sick with desire, right, with death. So the first sense is that sexuality is different from death, and the second is sexuality itself leads to death. Right? So these are two ways of glossing this line that reads, who should have been a bride, but who for joys brides hope to have, fell sick and died. And this turns on the meaning of the word for. Right? Does for mean something that's caused by something else, or does for mean something happens instead of something else? Now, there is another sense in which we can gloss the same words, which is, but who, because she had had the joys brides hope to have, fell sick and died. Right? That is, who had had the joys, meaning without being a bride, she had those joys. That is, she had partaken of sexual desire outside of wedlock, and this wrong or immoral or unsanctified or irreligious context in which sexuality was partaken of was what made it sinful. Sexuality itself is not sinful, but it becomes sinful when partaken outside wedlock. Right? Now, this rests on the identification of these bridal joys with the transitory and ultimately deadly joys offered by goblins. Right? Now, however, there's nothing in the poem to suggest that the brides hope to eat goblin fruit or to take gifts from goblin men. That is, so while the suggestion is that eating the fruits that the goblins sell leads to death, and this death appears to be like the death of those who partake of bridal joys, either outside or within wedlock. The point is that the poem does not ever equate the fruits that the goblins sell and which Laura has eaten with the death suffered by these brides, in whose cases the relationship between sexuality and death is clear. So the relation between fruits and death is clear because it is Laura who has eaten the fruits and who is starving, and if she continues on this road, she will die. The link between sexuality and death is clear. There are several biblical as well as other references, and many of those references are produced quite favorably. So we can assume that Christina Rossetti, as a writer and thinker, does not challenge those biblical associations of sexuality with death. However, there is still as yet no connection between eating those fruits and sexuality. Right? That part is left to speculation and suggestion. There are incredibly powerful suggestions. The language is very descriptive, suggestive. The tone as well as the meaning of the words suggest this connection, but it is never spelt out. And that is where a lot of the complexity of this poem lies. And that is also why this poem has generated a great deal of varying interpretations. It is possible to read this poem as a Christian allegory. It is also possible to read this poem as a celebration of queer love and sexuality. It is also possible to read this poem as a veiled critique of the Christian morality which equates sexuality with death. All of that turns on how one reads these descriptions of eating the fruit and the kind of emotional and physical consequences that eating the fruit produces. Let us read further. Lizzie breaks her resolve. She makes a difficult decision. When she sees Laura dwindling and about to die, Lizzie decides that she will take the risk. She will buy a fruit, whatever the consequences of that. She will buy a fruit for Laura just to ensure that Laura gets better. And this is a big decision for Lizzie because she doesn't know what dangers she might put herself in. Because simply allowing the goblin call to influence her, to persuade her, might open up new pathways, might lead to new and unexpected developments. And Lizzie is also concerned that if something happens to her, who will care for Laura? So it's a very difficult decision, but Lizzie plucks up the courage and decides to go and risk being corrupted or being influenced by the goblins. She kisses Laura across the heath with clumps of furze and goes back, and for the first time in her life began to listen and look. These are the words that Rossetti gives her. Until now, it has only been Laura who listens and looks. Lizzie is the one who closes her eyes and blocks her ears. Now, Lizzie is listening and looking, but there's a difference. She's doing it only because she is her sister's keeper, right? She wants to cure her sister. Lizzie meets the goblins, but the communication breaks down. At first, she receives a warm welcome, but soon she is rejected with anger and violence, right? The goblins first come towards her, and we get a very vivid description. The goblins came towards her, hobbling, flying, running, leaping, puffing, blowing, chuckling, clapping, crowning, clucking and gobbling, mopping and mowing. And the range of these verbs suggest a kind of frantic activity, which is also equated with the kind of wild and passionate energy that is also equated with sensuality and the pursuit of pleasure. This is also contrasted with the kind of listlessness and the lack of energy that Laura is currently suffering from, right? So the idea is that this is deceptive. All this energy, happiness, activity is a kind of trap. It lulls and attracts unsuspecting devotees, turns them into the very opposite of these happy, jumping, energetic goblins. Nonetheless, they surround her and they almost assault her. This is how the poem describes how the goblins react when they first see Lizzie. They hugged her and kissed her, squeezed and caressed her, and these words are suggestive again of the kind of association of eating the fruits, pursuing the pleasure of eating exotic foods, and the kind of pleasure that is both forbidden and precisely because of its forbidden nature, uh, pursued from sexuality and sexual desire. Nonetheless, all of this suggestion and energy doesn't affect Lizzie because she is very clear about why she's there, not the pursuit of pleasure for herself, but a sort of care and concern and desire to put her own sister in a better and safer place. Lizzie speaks, "Good folk, give me much and many," and holds out her apron, tosses them a penny, and says, basically, she says, "Take this money and give me some fruit." The goblins, however, deny that. They don't want her money. They want her to eat with them, just like they had experienced with Laura. They don't want money. And in the case of Laura, if you remember, Laura confessed that she didn't have money, and the goblins were more than happy to accept a lock of her blonde hair, gold colored hair, in exchange for the gold of money. They accepted a lock of her hair, which again has very strong associations with romantic love and sexuality in the history of English literature. So the goblins, it seems, are not interested in selling, and they are insulted if they are treated simply as sellers. Rather, what they seem to want is a sort of companionship. And the companionship of the goblins entails a sort of consumption of fruit in a way that has produced a death-like state for Laura, right? So what do the goblins say to Lizzie? They don't want her money. They say, "Nay, take a seat with us, honor and eat with us. Our feast is but beginning. Night yet is early, warm and dew pearly, wakeful and starry." Right? And then, "Such fruits as this no man can carry. Half their bloom would fly, half their dew would dry," etc. There are several moments in the poem when the goblins refer to their fruits as those which men cannot carry. Right? This again complicates the allegorical reading that the eating or the consumption of these fruits is similar to the partaking of sexual pleasure. The fact that goblins are themselves, as well as the narrator, repeatedly mentions that these are unlike human or male merchants suggests that there is something about the goblins which goes beyond human sexuality, right? They are desirous of company and companionship, and that is exactly what they tell Lizzie. They want Lizzie to feast with them, to be their guest. And this is exactly what Lizzie does not want. So Lizzie refuses and says, "Thank you, but one waits at home alone for me. So without further parleying, if you will not sell me any of your fruits, though much and many, give me back my silver penny I tossed you for a fee." And this angers the goblins. The refusal to partake of a feast with them, the refusal to sit and eat with them, this angers them, and this is how they react. Again, very violent. Again, the kind of violence that they inflict on Lizzie also has suggestions of a sort of not exactly, not something that is merely pecuniary or financial, but also has some suggestions of sexuality. Here is how they react. They began to scratch their pates, no longer wagging, purring, but visibly demurring, grunting and snarling. One called her proud, cross-grained, uncivil. Their tones waxed loud, their looks were evil. Lashing their tails, they trod and hustled her, elbowed and jostled her, clawed with their nails, barking, mewing, hissing, mocking, tore her gown and soiled her stocking, twitched her hair out by the roots, stamped upon her tender feet, held her hands, and squeezed their fruits against her mouth to make her eat. White and golden Lizzie stood like a lily in a flood, like a rock of blue-veined stone, lashed by tides obstreperously, like a beacon left alone in a hoary soaring sea, sending up a golden fire like a fruit-crowned orange tree, white with blossoms honey sweet, sore beset by wasp and bee, like a royal virgin town topped with gilded dome and spire, close beleaguered by a fleet mad to tug her standard down. So we can see that both in the manner in which the goblins attack her and the manner in which the narrator describes how Lizzie resisted the assault, there is more than a hint of a suggestion of asexual assault. The manner in which the metaphor of this fleet, which has a standard down, right? It suggests that while making or while forcing Lizzie to eat their fruits, the goblins resembled a sort of barbarian attack trying to violate the sexuality of a civilized female figure. The references to Virgin Town, the references to a fleet whose standard, which is a flag, was being forced to be pulled down, right? These are all associations with a sort of sexual violence, which is nonetheless used simply as a metaphor to describe how these goblins want to force this woman to simply eat the fruit that they are carrying. And finally, there's more violence. We are told that though the goblins cuffed and caught, coaxed and fought her, bullied, besought, scratched, pinched, kicked, knocked, mauled, mocked, etc., against all of this, in spite of all of these attacks and assaults, Lizzie stands her ground and feels the fluids or the juices of the fruits being smashed and smeared against her skin. And even while these fruits are being squeezed against her, she manages to resist. Right? And here is how the poet describes that resistance. Lizzie uttered not a word, would not open lip from lip, lest they should cram a mouthful in, but laughed in heart to feel the drip of juice that syruped all her face, and lodged in dimples of her chin, and streaked her neck, which quaked like curd. At last the evil people, worn out by her resistance, flung back her penny, kicked their fruit, and left. So again, the sensuousness of that description, the detail with which the narrator describes the juices of the fruits being squeezed against her face, dripping down her skin, the sensuousness of that mobilizes an association of fruit and its consumption with sexuality. But again, the point here is that Lizzie is not attracted. Lizzie resists the temptation. The fact that there is a temptation to be resisted and the fact that it is described in such bodily terms fuels the allegorical reading. But then again, very soon after this, we see the two sisters being reunited. And as soon as Lizzie returns home, we see a very different description of the consumption of fruit. And that description confirms the Eucharistic reading. Right? Lizzie says after she reaches home, "Laura, did you miss me? Come and kiss me. Never mind my bruises. Hug me, kiss me, suck my juices, squeezed from goblin fruits for you. Goblin pulp and goblin dew. Eat me, drink me, love me. Laura, make much of me. For your sake I have braved the glen and had to do with goblin merchant men." Now this passage incorporates Eucharistic language and it represents Lizzie in Christ-like terms. Now, just to quote one very important scriptural text, the prayer of consecration in the Holy Communion liturgy, Christ is quoted as saying, "Take, Eat, this is my body which is given for you. Drink ye all of this, for this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for you. Right? Lizzie also talks of my juices, which rhymes with my bruises, as if they are from her own body. And of course, the point is, readers know that these are not her juices, these are the juices of the fruits that the goblins have mashed and pulped against her, right? But the fact that Lizzie has withstood and resisted the temptation, she has suffered the experience of having those fruits mashed against her, gives her the right, the authority to claim that these are her juices, and that if Laura could love her, if Laura could, as Lizzie puts it, eat her, drink, love her, suck her juices, somehow it would carry a healing power as against the corrupting power that the fruits initially had, and which the corrupting power which reduced Laura to this death-like state when she consumed the fruits directly from the goblins. So the key difference is that while Laura had taken the fruits and eaten them herself, in this latter scenario, Laura is able to consume the same fruit, but she is consuming the juices after they have been squeezed against Lizzie's face. And after Lizzie has been forced to eat them, but actually refused to eat those fruits. The sensuality of this description is too obvious to need any comment, and too obvious to also challenge the Eucharistic reading, which merely supposes that Lizzie is a Christ-like figure who has suffered in order to heal her sister. Further, there is also a distinction between pulp and dew, which corresponds to the distinction between the two kinds of communion, that is bread and wine. Right? That the fruit which can bring death can, in this sacramental moment, bring life, has a theological basis. So this idea that the fruit is not in itself corrupt, or the fruit in itself has no power to corrupt, but it all depends on the particular manner or the context in which it is consumed, makes this particularly Eucharistic reading. In this lecture, we have discussed many portions of the poem which persuade us that the description of fruit and the description of eating corrupt fruit in Goblin Market is an allegorical reinforcement of the biblical association of consumption with mortality. However, if one reads the poem carefully, one finds that these descriptions of eating fruit are actually subordinate to the description of women's labor, women's domesticity, and how the domestic space is the foundation for sisterhood. Thank you.